Hey everybody, how's everybody's night going? Good? Yeah, fantastic? All right. So we are at the trends and opportunities portion of the evening. I'm sure you're all very excited for that. I will be, I guess, your host, for lack of a better word, Angela Ruth. I am the Director of PR at MWI and contributor to Entrepreneur and just an entrepreneur in general. So I will let each of you introduce yourselves, and I'm sorry, but Mike Abbott had to leave us. He might be back, but he had a board meeting scheduling conflict that he needed to get to. So, but he was here until like 2 seconds ago. So I will switch over and Ethan, go.
It is true. Mike was here. So I'm Ethan Kurzweil. I'm a partner with Bessemer Venture Partners. I've been with the firm 9 years now. I invest in consumer applications with an emphasis on video and future of entertainment, and then developer platforms. Invested in companies like Twitch and Periscope on the consumer side, and Twilio, SendGrid, Intercom, and several others on the developer side.
Arjun at Social Capital, been there about 1.5 years. Spent majority of my time in entrepreneurship, so social gaming, mobile messaging, etc. Most of my investments have been on the angel side, so companies like Gusto, Zenefits, Snapchat, pre-Series A, and I focus on consumer as well.
And Nathan Sanders, I'm a partner at TCB. We participate in a pretty different piece of the maturity cycle for companies. We're investing at a later stage, Series E, F, G, and in some cases even after that. So we're looking at companies that are typically at a much more mature level than I think the other panelists.
All right. So kicking off with questions. You know, I know a lot of things go into investing, and sometimes it's considered, you know, people are considered the big bucks up at the top of the goodness of companies. But would you say that you generally go with markets like emerging markets, or do you look for opportunity? Do you generally go with like things you know, or emerging markets that you haven't heard of or haven't dealt with before?
I think every investment firm probably has a different philosophy on how they think about stuff. I think we're set up a little bit differently. We think about opportunities at entry points, depending on markets and verticals. So, I mean, you know, we look at Asia. We spend about 20% of our personal time there in some capacity, so that we can understand the context of what's happening. That includes China, India, Malaysia. And then in the U.S., we don't look at trends specifically, because I think when people say trends or these are new hot areas to invest in, it's typically not a good area to invest in anymore, because everyone's kind of rushing to find the right companies, and the companies that were the good ones have probably already been funded. So I think we take a different approach and kind of do the work in the specific areas that we think are important.
Yeah, I mean, our philosophy as a firm is to look at different roadmap areas, and so that's investor defined. It all comes bottom up through our investment team of about 15 partners and 30 investment professionals to come up with some thesis that leads us to believe there'll be an area of opportunity that perhaps others are not looking at yet, or perhaps is underinvested from a sort of macro point of view. And sometimes that leads us to emerging markets. We have investing practices in Israel and India with teams on the ground in both of those places, because we felt like there was a specific roadmap or several roadmaps that we could apply to each of those local markets. And so an example of the philosophy on this is early on we met Jeff Lawson, the entrepreneur behind Twilio. We didn't have a particular thesis around developers as a particularly good entry point to sell to. But through working with him and sort of understanding the thesis behind which he was building the company, we identified one. We ended up leading their next round of investment, and then made a whole bunch of other investments that kind of had a similar theme to them. So we do try to before we make any sizable investment, we do try to have our own perspective and our own thesis. It's not always right. Sometimes we kill it off, we change it, we adapt, but that's our philosophy, is not to just kind of follow the herd or try to find interesting market trends, but have our own thinking that may or may not be contrarian.
And for us, we certainly look at trends, but ultimately, again, we're investing at a stage where our bet is less on a market trend and more on a specific company. We're trying to invest $100 or $200 million at a time, and at that point, the company is a level of scale where we can evaluate it on its own. Certainly, anytime you're investing in tech, there's newness to any element of any investment you make, whether that's geography or market trends. And when we do those kinds of things, we tend to do it really slowly. As an example, when we made a geographic expansion into Europe about 5 years ago, it was based on the fact that for the scale companies that we were looking at, increasingly we were seeing that the best company in the world at something was not headquartered here. Spotify would certainly be a good example of that, where we felt they were the leading music streaming service back then. They just happened to be headquartered in Stockholm. So increasingly we're seeing that type of expansion, but again, it happens, for us at least, at a pretty slow and measured pace.
Just real quick, just to echo what they're saying, I guess, to just give you a better example of how this kind of plays out, is just to say, we started making investments in mobile. It could be game companies, it could be anything. You kind of have to understand the full stack. So if you have a consumer company in mobile, then you'll get exposed to understanding what the full stack means around what type of infrastructure they need to build, what type of analytics. So we'll start looking at companies across that, which is how do you invest in the full ecosystem at the same time, rather than just one investment, because a lot of the companies won't be successful at the front end if the rest of the technology stack can't work in accordance. So if you take that mindset and you build out your mental model across multiple areas, so for instance, let's take India or Malaysia. A lot of the e-commerce companies, that in order for them to succeed, you need shipping and logistics, you need mobile payments, you need internet connectivity. So you kind of have to have the context of where you're investing at what time, and where your investment is going to have the most return to a certain extent.
So you mentioned India. I know, I'm sure a lot of us know that in as far as the U.S. and China make up a lot of U.S. dollar billionaires. However, in recent years, Forbes compiles a list of basically the top billionaires in the world. And in recent years, India has actually jumped up significantly in the number of dollars and the number of billionaires. Do you guys see an opportunity there? Is it because at one point it was a huge emerging market, and then it kind of dialed back a little bit, but do you guys see opportunities there?
Yeah, we have a team of about 10 people on the ground in India and have been there since 2005, so absolutely. I think the billionaires are driven by sort of the big companies at the top of the pyramid. And in India, societally has been hard for sort of entrepreneurs without the connections to break into. That's changing over time, but it does tend to be sort of access to partnerships or capital somewhat restricted in that economy today. And again, that's opening up a lot. But we do see lots of entrepreneurs. There's an e-commerce war going on in India now, and that's spawning a lot of companies that come out of that. There's opportunity for a lot of as internet penetration in India gets to closer to U.S. levels. There's just a big class of Indian consumers that consumer startups are perfectly targeted to. And there's some differences in the economy and payment infrastructure and shipping infrastructure and all that make some startups apply equally well, some less well, and there's sort of infrastructure challenges to overcome. But over time, a lot of opportunity for entrepreneurship there, as we see it.
Yeah, I'll echo Ethan's thoughts. I think what you saw, 10 years. It's not like India hasn't had investments in the past. I think what you saw in the past were more companies that were call center or BPO or development related. Now they're thinking about India as a market itself. It's also something to remember is I think the investor set. I think India has been overfunded completely in the last couple of years, and also a lot of the investor set, coming from the United States, we kind of have this hubris to say, cool, Uber worked, let's find the Uber for India or the Uber for China. Now, in the case of China, DiDi's a great company, but like we tend to think of the parallels that we have here in the United States that work, and say, okay, let's go fund that in those countries. That usually never works very well, because again, the infrastructure is different, connectivity is different, customer base is different. So when we go, think about the context of where we want to invest, we're not thinking about like, oh, let's think about more, e-commerce companies or mobile companies, because that's the state of where the United States is at. You have to think about like where the community and the customer set is at, and understand, where do you want to start making that investment and at what entry point.
And also, as U.S. companies have global ambitions, occasionally the Amazon of India will be Amazon, or the Uber of India will be Uber, or not necessarily in those particular cases, but you really do have to think about the competencies of the entrepreneur and the specific needs of the local economy to find the best investments. I completely agree.
Nothing? All right. You want to cut this short, don't you? No. So what would you say is the greatest opportunity or the shining beacons, or dare we say unicorn? I'll try not to use that word. I just feel like it's completely overused. But what would you say are some of the industries that are that shining beacon of opportunity? Anywhere. Yeah, globally.
I guess I'll start